In November of 1864, famed frontiersman Kit Carson went picking a fight with the lords of the Southern Plains. The bloody engagement that followed, known as the First Battle of Adobe Walls, saw Carson and his men outnumbered 10-1 against the Comanche and their allies. And trust me when I say you are not going to believe how it turned out. Who was Kit Carson and why did he go picking a fight with the Comanche on their own home turf? What the hell is Adobe Walls, and what did Carson get up to for the remainder of his time on Earth? What sort of legacy did he leave behind? Join me today as we discuss all of this and more, including why you should never, ever panic. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Back in 1864, the Comanche and their allies, namely the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, were making life just a tad bit difficult for travelers along the Santa Fe Trail. They were, as at least one observer put it, having a quote-unquote high carnival, and scarcely a week would go by without some type of outrage being committed by them. What's more, they weren't even being shy about it. The Comanches were boasting that they'd kill every white man that dared set foot on the road, and if General Carleton, the commander of military forces over in New Mexico, even so much as retaliated, they'd kill him too. And honestly, the Comanche had every reason to be bold. For the last few years, the soldiers had all been fighting each other back east during the Civil War, leaving a whole lot of land virtually unprotected. Hell, it was during this time that the entire line of the frontier in Texas was pushed back 100 miles due to raids from the Comanche and the Kiowas. Things got so bad that eventually the aforementioned General Carleton ended up sending Kit Carson to go nip these depredations in the bud. Now, if you don't mind, just in case there are any new listeners, I would like to do a very quick recap of Carson's life prior to taking on the Comanche. Kit first came west in 1826 at the young age of 16. Fell in with a motley crew of mountain men, and over the course of the next decade or so, would end up making one hell of a name for himself as a fur trapper and so-called Indian fighter. Carson may have been short in stature, he only stood around 5.5 feet tall, but what he lacked in height he more than made up for in courage and grit, as evidenced by his many engagements with hostile natives, Mexican and Confederate soldiers, and at least one giant of a French Canadian who was greatly lacking in the manners department. While Carson could neither read nor write, he certainly weren't no dummy. Dude was fluent in Spanish and French, could speak several indigenous dialects as well as sign language, and could basically converse with anyone of any tribe west of the Mississippi River. He may not have been able to follow the letters on a page, but Kit could track pretty much anything that moved. Knew how to locate game and watering holes, how to smell an ambush from a mile away, how to read the weather, and by the time he was sent to pacify the Comanche, Carson was already a veteran of 2 wars and had damn near the entirety of the western United States mapped out in his head. In other words, Kit Carson was an extremely capable frontiersman. And thanks to the Civil War, he was also a colonel in the by God U.S. Army. After the Battle of Valverde, he was sent to deal with the Mescalero Apaches, followed by a very similar campaign against the Navajo in 1863. An extremely brutal campaign that would end up bringing the mighty Navajo Nation to its knees, albeit temporarily. Sadly, the Navajo were then subjected to what's known as the Long Walk, aka the Western Trail of Tears, where they were forced to march hundreds of miles east to join the Mescalero on a good-for-nothing reservation known as the Bosque Redondo. Like I said, this was just a very brief rundown of events leading up to the Battle of Adobe Walls. Right or wrong, Carson had proved extremely effective against the indigenous, and as such, it was only natural that he'd be the one sent east to face off with the Comanche. That said, the Comanche posed their own unique set of difficulties, to say the least. Now, Carson's plan was to strike the Comanche in their winter camps, sort of catch them with their pants down, so to speak, and do as much damage as possible. If Carson could destroy their villages, including their stores of dried meat and buffalo robes, then maybe, just maybe, the Comanches could be talked into surrendering. And yeah, so it were that Colonel Kit Carson set out in mid-November of 1864, with a couple of mountain howitzers and around 400 men, 75 of whom were his trusty Ute scouts. Now just a quick tangent, but it's worth noting that Carson wasn't doing all that great health-wise. The former mountain man had 55 years of hard living under his belt. His joints ached, his eyesight seemed to be failing, and most troubling of all were the lingering effects of an accident from a few years prior when a horse rolled over on him. Just weren't no two ways about it. Kit was not the same man he'd been even just a decade earlier. Hell, there were some who even questioned whether or not he was still able to sit a saddle. Carson was tough, though, and although in constant pain and plagued with exhaustion, he was able to successfully guide his troops to the heart of Comancheria. It was there, about 70 miles north of present-day Amarillo, where Kit's scouts located a small Kiowa village along the banks of the Canadian River. The next morning, which just so happened to be Thanksgiving Day, Kit ordered one of his officers, a Major William McCleve, to go ahead and lead the charge. Now, like I said, this was just a small village with less than 100 lodges. But be that as it may, the Kiowa weren't no pushovers. Their warriors fought bravely and saw to it that the women and children were able to escape before they too followed suit, temporarily leaving the camp in the hands of Major McCleve. And I say temporarily because, unbeknownst to either McCleve or Carson, there was a much larger camp of Comanche further upriver. Sure, the Kiowa may have fled, but they soon returned with reinforcements. A lot of reinforcements. Carson rode out to McCleve's aid, and upon seeing just how dire the situation was, he ordered everyone to fall back several hundred yards to an old trading post known as Adobe Walls. Originally founded by the Bent brothers back in 1843, the walls would be abandoned just a few years later due to trouble with the hostiles. And by the time Carson and his men arrived, there weren't much left other than a few crumbling adobe walls, hence the name. Crumbling or not, though, this would provide the soldiers a bit of cover as they prepared to fend off the Kiowa and Comanche. The only problem was there was way more warriors than Carson had initially figured, an estimated 1,400. And brother, they were not in a good mood. Just as soon as Carson and the men managed to corral their horses and set up a defensive perimeter, the warriors came thundering in. A wild painted mass of some of the greatest horsemen the world had ever seen charging straight at them. That's where those mountain howitzers came into play. Not sure if this was the first time the Comanche had ever experienced artillery or not, but it did seem to turn the tide, at least momentarily, stopping the charge and pushing the warriors back out of range. Now, Kit Carson may have been a living legend, but he also wasn't above making the occasional mistake. In this case, he erroneously figured that the warriors wouldn't dare make another charge on the walls. Hell, Carson was even planning on leading a counterattack of his own. Or at least he was, until he spied something extremely concerning on the horizon. Hey, real quick, today's episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by Manscaped. Look, bro, you and I both know that your balls deserve better. And that's where Manscaped comes into play, especially their Beard and Balls bundle, featuring the Lawnmower 5.0 and the Beard Hedger, a trimmer for the moneymaker, i.e. your face, and another for those boys downstairs. Trust me, I can personally attest that Manscaped really does work wonders. Not only will you be looking and feeling great, but you'll also be saving time. Yeah, with Manscaped, you can say au revoir to endless passes, because this trimmer gets it right the first time, cutting through the bushiest of man bushes effortlessly while being gentle on the skin and your most delicate of delicates. But Josh, how is that even possible? I'm trying to tell you, okay? 2 interchangeable skin-safe blade heads. That's how. Oh, and did I mention that it's waterproof? In other words, you can trim those family jewels of yours right there in the shower. And that's just the Lawnmower 5.0. Don't even get me started on the Beard Hedger. Okay, fine, I'll get started. Whether you're going for a neat stubble or a full-on lumberjack look, the Beard Hedger's got you covered. And with a titanium-coated stainless steel T-blade with 20 different length options, you can tame that facial wilderness of yours into just about any style that you can imagine. And just like with the lawnmower, the Beard Hedger is waterproof. Really, it's a no-brainer. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra will ensure that you're always looking your best below the waist, while the Beard Hedger takes care of everything above. So what exactly are you waiting for? Get 20% off plus free shipping with the code WILDWEST at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code WILDWEST at manscaped.com. For the premium grooming experience, trust Manscaped. To once again quote Carson biographer Hampton Sides, the soldiers had a meager haversack lunch of dried meat and hardtack, and after lunch, Carson planned to push downriver and attack the Comanche villages, one by one. But then he noticed something alarming taking shape on the Blonde Plains. He had been wrong. The Comanche and Kiowa allies were massing again, this time in far greater numbers. As he watched the situation develop from his remove at Adobe Walls, Carson became increasingly anxious. 3,000 mounted warriors had emerged from the Comanche villages. In a few short minutes, Carson was facing one of the largest engagements of Native American fighters ever gathered in the West. Certainly, Carson had never seen such a concentration of warriors. His men were outnumbered nearly 10-1. So yeah, not really looking all that promising, right? Those that weren't done eating tossed their hardtack aside as the hostiles came charging yet again. Howitzers be damned. The soldiers would manage to turn them, only to then find themselves under attack from the opposite direction. Just wave after unrelenting wave of painted warriors throwing everything they had at the walls. Even Carson himself would later admit that the warriors, quote, acted with more daring and bravery than I have ever before witnessed. As the fight progressed, the gunpowder hung thick in the air, choking throats as the cannons boomed and the rifles cracked. Men and horses alike screamed out in fear and pain, their cries of agony mixing with the terrible war whoops of the Ute and Kiowa and Comanches. And during all of this chaos came the curious sound of dueling bugles. Yes, dueling bugles. Apparently someone on the Comanche side had themselves an old army bugle, and what's more, they knew how to use it. When Kit's horse soldiers would sound advance, the Comanche bugler would sound retreat, and vice versa. When the army would sound retreat, the Comanche would sound charge. This ended up causing all sorts of confusion for the soldiers till they finally figured out what the hell was going on. Now the battle would end up raging for hours, well into the evening. And had it not been for Carson's leadership, coupled with those mountain howitzers, of course, there's a damn good chance this would have turned into another little bighorn. No matter how bad things got throughout all the mayhem and confusion, Kit was there, exhorting his men to remain calm. Focus on the direct threat, this incoming charge. Don't worry about those other warriors massing in the distance. Worry about what's right here, right in front of your face. Don't falter. Keep fighting. Great advice, by the way, right? For anything you may be facing in life. Sometimes it can be very easy to get overwhelmed. Just focus on the immediate, take it one issue at a time, and don't quit. Now, with all that in mind, Colonel Carson also knew damn well that he and his men couldn't hold the Comanche off indefinitely. I mean, let's face it, unlike in the movies, they only had so much ammo, right? A few more of these charged and the troops would be reduced to swinging their rifles like clubs. So, that being the case, Carson had a decision to make. Even as his own officers began to pressure him to push forward and mount a counterattack, Carson instead chose to retreat. You gotta remember, Kit weren't no George Custer. He wasn't a glory seeker, and he never had been. Didn't even have the usual habit of telling tall tales like many of his mountain men brethren. What's more, Carson could also decipher when someone had bitten off more than they could handle. It didn't happen to him often, but this is just one of those situations where he had to accept the loss and just try to save as many of his men as possible. That said, a retreat doesn't necessarily equate to survival. The soldiers were still greatly outnumbered. If they had any chance of living to see Christmas, they'd have to fight their way out of hell in as orderly a manner as possible. If they were just to willy-nilly light out for the hills, every man for himself, it would all but guarantee a massacre. Nah, this would be a disciplined retreat with Carson continuing to urge his men to remain steady, to not give in to fear. And believe me when I say the Comanches didn't let up the slightest. Truth be told, this retreat saw some of the fiercest fighting of the day. According to Carson, quote, the Indians charged so repeatedly and with such desperation that for some time I had serious doubts for the safety of my rear, end quote. Now, he was most likely talking about the safety of the column's rear, but no doubt each and every man there had misgivings about their own literal rear ends. Then, all of a sudden, just because why not, I mean, nobody said war was going to be easy, the Comanches went ahead and set the grass on fire, engulfing the soldiers in smoke and using it as a screen to get even closer. And all the while, those two little cannons kept up their fire, doing what they could to stem the tide. Finally, as the sun began to settle on the horizon, just as it seemed things couldn't get any worse, the warriors relented. I guess they figured they had taught these white devils enough of a lesson for one day and just decided to ride on back to their villages. Now, Carson would not use this as an excuse to slow down. He ordered his men to keep on moving, riding throughout the night and not stopping for a break until later on the following day. When Kit finally called the troops to a halt, he himself had been on horseback so long that when he removed the saddle, the horse's skin came off with it. And that there was the first Battle of Adobe Walls. To this day, it's still considered a toss-up as to who won. Both sides would claim victory, and, well, I guess it just depends on what your definition of victory is. Was Carson able to bring the Comanche to hill in the same way he did to the Mescalero and the Navajo? Not by a long shot. Hell, it was almost a miracle that he was even able to get his men out of there alive. Most of them, at least. In that sense, it's clearly an indigenous victory, as the Comanche and Kiowas held the field of battle. and they would continue to hold it for years to come. However, if your interpretation of victory is survival, then I'd say Kit and his men did one heck of a job. This next part is almost unbelievable, but only 3 soldiers, possibly as many as 6 depending on your sources, lost their lives during all that fighting, with just 21 receiving wounds. And that was after being outnumbered 10-1. Whatever it was that Carson did to hold his men in line and keep them steady during that retreat should probably be taught in military academies, if it isn't already. Also, by Native American standards, Carson's foray into Comancheria was also somewhat of a victory. Tribes like the Comanche didn't think in terms of long, drawn-out military campaigns like the white man did. A successful raid for them meant to head into your enemy's territory, strike quickly, do as much damage as possible, and then get the hell back home without suffering much in the way of losses. And by that metric, I'd say that Carson outdid himself. Remember, he only lost a handful of men at the most, whereas the natives, once again depending on sources, lost anywhere from 50 to upwards of 200 fighting men. As far as the army was concerned, officially, it was a victory. I mean, what else is new, right? Those pencil pushers always know how to make things sound better than they are. Carson's commanding officer, General Carleton, called it a brilliant affair and praised Kit for how he met so formidable an enemy and defeated him, saying that the battle was another green leaf to the laurel wreath which you have so nobly won in service to your country. And what did Kit Carson think of the first Battle of Adobe Walls? Well, in his own words, it's pretty evident. Quote, "The Indians whipped me in that fight." End quote. Now, as for Carson, he'd spend the next 3.5 years pretty much constantly on the move. First at Fort Union, then Fort Garland, and finally Fort Lyon, up in present-day Colorado. The fight at Adobe Walls would be his last, and Carson was finally mustered out of the Army in November of 1867. And for the rest of his days, he'd act as a peacemaker rather than a fighter, helping to negotiate treaties with Native Americans, including his old friends, the Ute. He even took one final trip back to Washington, D.C. during the late winter and early spring of 1868. Officially, this was on business. Carson was traveling with Chief Ouray and a delegation of Ute looking to secure a more permanent reservation. Unofficially, he was also looking to get a second opinion regarding his health. Kit hadn't been feeling up to snuff for quite some time, and a Dr. Henry Tilton over at Fort Lyon had recently diagnosed him with having an aneurysm of the aorta. Guess Kit figured that somebody back east might just have a cure. While in D.C., he met with General Sheridan and Sherman, as well as his old friend John C. Fremont. Matter of fact, it was Fremont who recommended a doctor over in New York City. As such, Carson took a train to Manhattan, Ute warriors in tow. They stayed at the Metropolitan Hotel on Broadway, and yeah, unfortunately, according to the learned doctor there in New York, Kit was indeed suffering from an aneurysm. The Sawbones even told Kit it was just a matter of time and there wasn't nothing nobody but God could do about it. Later on that evening, Carson had a nightmare that he was dying, felt his body floating up towards the ceiling, and he woke in a cold sweat with one of the Ute chiefs holding his head as if he were a child, saying that he had been crying out for his Lord Jesus. Now, at the same time all of this was occurring, Kit's wife Josefa was pregnant with yet another child, baby number 7 if I'm not mistaken. And considering this most recent diagnosis, Carson was bound and determined to stay alive long enough to get home and at least see the child born. He may have possibly consulted with another doctor in Boston before catching a train to Cheyenne. From there, he caught a stage to Denver, at which point he was so exhausted that he had to spend 3 days at a hotel just to gather his strength. Once he was able, Kit hitched a ride in the back of a wagon to La Junta, where he and Josefa were finally reunited. Just in time, as 2 days later, she'd give birth to a little girl they named Josefita. By this point, Kit was so worn out that he could barely muster up the strength to hold his own baby. What's more, he had also taken to coughing up blood. Dr. Tilton prescribed him a mixture of opium and muscle sedative, and when that didn't work, he simply knocked the old mountain man out with a healthy dose of chloroform. Sadly, Kit's wife Josefa was faring even worse. She had fallen prey to an infection after giving birth, and despite Doc Tilton's best efforts, she died in Carson's arms just 2 weeks later. One second she was feeling all right and brushing out the hair of her teenage daughter, Teresina, and the next she was hollering out for Kit, Cristobal she called him. It was all he could do to rise from his own cot and come to her aid, but he managed, and that's when she passed. According to their son Charles, Kit just sort of pined away after Josefa's death. He sent for her sister Ignatia to come take care of the children as his own health continued to deteriorate. He took to staying at Doc Tilton's place for round-the-clock treatment, just laying on a little cot in his buffalo robes, trying not to choke on his own blood. In the evenings, Tilton would entertain Carson by reading to him from his own biography, The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. Apparently, back in the late 1850s, Kit had dictated a memoir of sorts to a guy named Jesse Turley, who in turn handed the manuscripts over to another guy by the name of DeWitt Peters. Although not as fanciful as the Penny Dreadfuls, Peters still couldn't resist adding in quite a bit of fluff, or as Carson described it, Peters laid it on a little thick. Now, as bad as Kit was feeling, he did seem to rally a little on the evening of May 23, 1868. Told the doc to fetch him a big buffalo steak and a cup of coffee, and after eating and drinking his fill, he reclined back in his robes and lit up his old clay pipe. Not long thereafter, at approximately 4:25 p.m., Kit began to cough up blood uncontrollably. I guess that aneurysm had finally ruptured. He hollered out to Tilton, "Doctor, compadre, adios." And that was it. The good doctor rushed to his side and held Kit till he gave up the ghost. Carson was 58 and a half years old and died exactly 1 month to the day after the death of his beloved Josefa. The two were buried next to one another there in Boggsville, just outside of Fort Lyon, but a few years later they'd be reinterred to Taos, New Mexico, where they remain to this day at the Kit Carson Memorial Cemetery. Now, speaking of New Mexico, at the same time that Carson was breathing his last there in Colorado, there were interesting things afoot down in the land of enchantment. Just a few days following Kit's death, General Sherman paid a visit to the Bosque Redondo, taking in the horrid conditions with his own two eyes. Quote, "I found the Bosque a mere spot of grass in the midst of a wild desert. The Navajos had sunk into a condition of absolute poverty and despair." End quote. As such, Sherman saw to it that a new treaty was drawn up on June 1st, 1868, giving the Navajo a huge swath of land roughly the size of Ohio to call their own. The area wasn't near as big as their original territory, but it was in their former homeland, and it did include their sacred Canyon de Chelly. Weeks later, on June 18th, their journey home began. Story goes that when the Navajo reached the Rio Grande and saw the Blue Bead Mountains for the first time since leaving, they fell to their knees and began to weep. As the march home continued, they began to chant an old song. "Beauty before us, beauty behind us, beauty around us. In beauty we walk. It is finished in beauty." And I guess that's about all I've got on the life and times of Kit Carson. Now, one of the books I leaned on heavily while researching this series, you've heard me mention it and quote from it a dozen times, was Blood and Thunder by Hampton Sides. Excellent read, and I would strongly suggest you picking up a copy of your own if you'd like to learn more. And fingers crossed, but it does look like Hollywood might just be interested in adapting Mr. Sides' book for the big screen. This may be old news, and it may no longer be relevant, but way back, I think it was in 2021, Hampton Sides was interviewed on the Meat Eater podcast, during which he let it slip that the book had been optioned by HBO, the same bunch of people that brought us Game of Thrones. Look, I know these things often fall by the wayside. Books get optioned all the time, and nothing ever comes of it. I did do a quick search, and I wasn't able to find any new info. But if this is true, if HBO really did want to make a series on Kit Carson, I think that would be fantastic. As far as I'm concerned, they are the only network that consistently puts out great shows, or at least they used to be. The Sopranos, Deadwood, Rome, Band of Brothers, The Pacific, Game of Thrones, Curb Your Enthusiasm, True Detective, Boardwalk Empire, Sex and the City if you happen to have a vagina. So yeah, if I could choose anyone to tell Carson's story, it would be HBO. I do think they'd be able to find the right balance. So who knows? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And hey, HBO, if you're listening and looking for someone to narrate, I ain't cheap, but I can be had. Now, as far as Carson's legacy is concerned, to some, he remains a hero, and to others, especially the Navajo, for obvious reasons, he is considered a villain. I've even seen interviews where Carson is compared to Hitler. There ain't no two ways about it. Kit's relationship with the Native Americans was complicated at best. He lived with them for decades. He had 2 Native American wives, Native American children, and he was considered a lifelong friend and advocate for several tribes, including the Ute. He flat out refused orders to shoot Apaches and Navajo men on sight. He condemned Colonel Shivington as a dog for his part in the Sand Creek Massacre, and during his years as an Indian agent in Taos, Kit was considered to have been fair and compassionate. Yet at the same time, you can't ignore the fact that he helped to hunt down indigenous slaves in California. He'd also take part in at least 2 massacres there in California, not to mention the attack on the Klamath Village up in Oregon. Sure, he condemned Sand Creek, which accounted for over 200 dead Cheyenne and Arapaho, but those lesser-known massacres that Kit was involved in had an even higher death toll. And then, of course, it was Carson who carried out the U.S. Army's scorched earth policy on the Navajo, basically starving them into submission. Kit would not personally take part in the Long Walk other than gathering the prisoners, and his tenure on the Bosque Redondo was very short-lived, just 3 months. But nonetheless, he still gets the bulk of the blame nowadays when it comes to the thousands of Navajo who needlessly perished. And even if you take the Long Walk out of the equation, how many Navajo children starved to death just during Kit's campaign at Canyon de Chelly? So I don't know, man. I do think both sides have legitimate claims. Carson was a heroic figure, no doubt, and I truly do believe he felt like he was doing his duty. If anything, I do think that was one of Carson's biggest flaws, his hesitancy to say no to those in authority. Remember, he initially wanted nothing to do with going after the Navajo. He tried to resign, but his request was denied. Even after the Long Walk, Kit would try to quit the Army on numerous occasions, but they didn't finally let him off the hook till his health got so bad he couldn't sit a saddle. Now, this next little bit is apocryphal. We don't know if it's true or not, but according to a writer who kept a diary while in the company of General Sherman, Carson had told Sherman, quote, "General, I'm not so sure the Great Spirit means for us to take over Indian lands. Let me lead them back while they still have the will to live," end quote. Once again, there's no way to prove whether this is true or not, but if it is, it could be that Carson was the reason that Sherman let the Navajo return to their homeland, but I don't know. You know, when it comes to history, it is very tempting at times to play whataboutism. But at the end of the day, I gotta think that there must have been a better way of doing things than the Long Walk or the Bosque Redondo. There had to have been a better way to stop the warriors from going on raids without killing thousands of innocent people, without starving children. And, as we just learned, it was all for nothing, as both the Navajo and the Mescaleros would end up going back to their own land within just a few years. All of that suffering for nothing. So yeah, history is just a series of extremely complicated people trying to live their lives in extremely complicated situations. So what do you think? Was Kit Carson a hero or a bad guy? Or just somewhere in the middle? Hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com and let me know. Oh, and before I forget, I was recently contacted by a guy named Martin Jagers. He's the president of the Kit Carson House National Landmark down in Taos, and apparently Kit's old home has fallen into disrepair. I don't know much about this. I don't know this guy Martin other than his email, so please double check on all of this, but the house, which was originally built back in 1825, needs a lot of work done to it. If you'd like to learn more, including how to help restore Carson's old home, check out the website kitcarsonhouse.org. Link down below in the show notes. All right, and I think that about does it for Kit Carson. Thank you so much for listening, and welcome to all the new listeners. Glad to have you on board. I most likely will not be posting a new episode next week, maybe not even for another 2 weeks. I just gotta get all my ducks in a row. You know how it goes. This stuff just takes time. But I do have something new in the works that I think you might be interested in. I don't want to give it away just yet, but I will say that subscribers over on Patreon and Into History will be the first to experience it. Ooh, what could it be? That's patreon.com/Wild West Extra or intohistory.com/Wild West Extra for exclusive content and an ad-free listening experience. All right, till next time, as my friend Michael over at Texas History Lessons likes to say, just be nice to one another. Okay? I'm talking to you. Yeah, you. Just be nice. Adios.